The first slight of the evening was meant to sound like a kindness, but Iris Vane, Duchess of Renwick, heard the knife folded inside it clearly enough. She did not turn. She did not lower her head. She did not give the room the satisfaction of watching her flinch, and so the moment passed as such moments were designed to pass, smoothly, deniably, leaving no mark that could be produced later as evidence. London wore the spring of 1819 the way a debutante wore her first silk, overconfident, a touch too bright, certain nothing could stain it before morning. And the townhouse on Bellamy Square that night had been dressed to match the city's mood, every candle doubled in a mirror, every mirror doubled in a window, so that the light seemed to breed itself indefinitely and ask nothing in return. It was not a house built to welcome her. It was a house built to be admired, which was a different thing entirely, and Iris had learned the difference the way she had learned most things since her marriage, by standing very still at the edge of a room and watching what the center did without her. The Ton had settled on a word for her some months before, and had never once seen fit to retire it, passing it hand to hand at card tables and in carriage seats, as though it were a coin too dull to spend on anything but her. Convenient. The Duke of Renwick had made a convenient marriage. His wife was, by every account that mattered, a convenient sort of woman, unremarkable in face, unremarkable in fortune, remarkable only in the tidy, bloodless efficiency with which she had settled her father's debts by way of a wedding ring. It was not cruelty exactly, the way the word was used. It was worse than cruelty, because it wore the coat of simple description, and a woman could not very well take offense at being accurately named. Convenient, they called her, the way one might call a well-placed umbrella stand convenient, useful in the particular weather, forgettable in the fair. She wore, that night, a gown the color of weak tea, chosen because it would not compete with anything, and would therefore offend no one, and at her wrist, hidden beneath a plain glove, she carried the one object in that glittering house that seemed to know her name. It was not jewelry. Other women wore sapphires banked like small blue fires against their throats, or garnets set in gold that caught the candlelight and threw it back doubled, tripled, and Iris wore, instead, a narrow ribbon threaded through her reticule strings, and at the end of that ribbon, a rosewood workbox no larger than a prayer book, its lid chipped along one corner where it had once been dropped down a flight of stairs by a girl too young to know its worth. Inside it lived a silver thimble, thinned almost to a shell by 20 years of use, engraved along its rim, with 2 letters gone soft with handling, M and F, for Margaret Fenwick, who had died when Iris was 14, and had left her daughter exactly 3 things of value: a good name unaccompanied by money, a habit of plain speech she had been made to unlearn in company, and the box itself worn smooth in a way no new thing could ever be worn, because newness, her mother used to say, was the one kind of beauty that could not be earned, only bought, and bought things had a way of being taken back. "Sew your own seams, Iris," her mother had told her once, guiding her daughter's clumsy fingers through a hem by the light of a tallow candle. Borrowed thread always pulls loose. Iris had not understood it then. She had understood almost nothing then, being 8 years old and mostly concerned with the ache in her fingertips. But the sentence had lodged itself somewhere behind her ribs the way certain sentences do, waiting patiently for a life large enough to prove them true, and in the 2 years since her marriage she had turned it over so many times in the dark that its wooden grain had worn as smooth as the thimble itself. No one at Bellamy Square that night would have credited her with a single useful thought in her head, and this was, itself, a kind of quiet joke the room did not know it was telling, because not 40 minutes earlier, in the cloakroom passage, Iris had discovered a footman's tray of half-filled champagne glasses balanced precariously on a folding table whose leg had begun, silently, to give way beneath the weight of the evening's excess, and had simply reached out, without comment, without summoning anyone, and wedged a folded card beneath the failing leg until it held. No one saw her do it. That, too, was familiar. The tray did not fall. The wine did not spill across the pale Turkish carpet the Dowager Duchess prized above several of her living relations, and the evening proceeded exactly as though catastrophe had never brushed so close to it, which was, Iris had come to understand, the precise nature of most of the good she did in that house. It went entirely unwitnessed, and unwitnessed good, she sometimes thought, was still good, though it did leave a person wondering, on the longer evenings, whether goodness required a witness at all in order to count as real. No thunder marked the tray's survival. No curtain fell to signal the small mercy of averted embarrassment. The orchestra in the next room merely continued its cheerful, indifferent scraping, and the party went on being a party, entirely unaware that it had, for one instant, teetered on the edge of its own minor ruin, and been quietly saved by the convenient wife nobody had thought to ask. The marriage itself required no great mystery to explain, and the ton had long since stopped pretending otherwise, though it continued, out of some collective sense of theater, to discuss the arrangement in the hushed, delighted tones usually reserved for scandal rather than mere arithmetic. Alistair Vane, 7th Duke of Renwick, had come into his title at 28, already burdened with a father's debts, a mother's expectations, and a coldness of manner the ton had long ago decided was simply the natural temperature of very high rank, the way certain rooms are always cool, regardless of the weather outside them. He had met Iris Fenwick at a country assembly neither of them had wished to attend, had observed within the space of one dance that she possessed a head for figures her own father lacked entirely, and had proposed to her not quite a fortnight later with the brisk, unromantic efficiency of a man closing a business account, in terms that left no room for misunderstanding on either side. He required a wife who would not embarrass him and would not cost him more than she was worth. She required a way to keep her father's remaining creditors from the door and her father's name from the papers. It was not a courtship. It was a transaction conducted in the language of courtship, and both parties had understood this perfectly well at the time, which made it all the stranger, in the 2 years since, that neither of them had found a way to say so out loud. He had not installed her at Bellamy Square, where his mother, the Dowager Duchess, presided over the family's public face with a serenity that had never once required warmth to accomplish its purpose. He had taken, instead, a modest leased house 3 streets removed, in a square respectable enough to avoid comment, and unfashionable enough to avoid attention, and had told her, on the single occasion he troubled to explain himself, that she would find it more comfortable there, away from his mother's particular manner of conversation. It was not unkindness, precisely, it was worse than unkindness, in the way that convenient was worse than cruel, because it had the shape of consideration, and none of its substance, a husband arranging his wife's life for his own comfort and calling it hers. She had lived in that leased house for 2 years now, visited by her husband perhaps once a fortnight, for dinners that lasted precisely as long as courtesy required, and ended precisely when courtesy permitted him to leave, and she had furnished her days there with the small, uncredited competencies that had always been her particular gift, balancing accounts the estate's own steward found baffling, coaxing a neglected garden back into modest bloom, mending what could be mended rather than replacing what could simply be bought. It was not a marriage, it was an arrangement wearing a marriage's clothes, and Iris had made her peace with it in the particular way a person makes peace with weather, by ceasing to expect it to change and learning instead how to dress for it. The music thinned as it always did before a name of consequence entered a room. conversation dropping half a register the way a tide draws back before it turns, and Iris felt the shift before she saw its cause. The particular held quality of air that meant someone worth watching had arrived, and she was not surprised when she turned to find Lady Seraphina Marlowe framed in the doorway with the unhurried confidence of a woman who had never once entered a room and found it indifferent to her arrival. Seraphina was, by any fair accounting, the Tun's favored daughter that season, cousin to the Duke on his mother's side, possessed of a fortune large enough to render her opinions fashionable and a wit sharp enough to render them memorable, and it had been generally assumed before the announcement of Alistair's engagement 2 years prior that she was the woman he would marry. An assumption Seraphina herself had never troubled to correct and had, if anything, continued to cultivate in the years since, the way a gardener continues tending a bed whose planting has technically been reassigned to someone else. She crossed the room toward Iris now with a smile already arranged, the kind of smile that photographed well and meant nothing, and said, in a voice pitched precisely to carry to the 3 or 4 guests standing nearest, "How well you look this evening, Iris. That shade suits a woman who need not compete for attention." The words sounded like a compliment. The pressure beneath them was not. It was not a compliment at all, but a verdict delivered in the shape of one, naming Iris's dress the color of surrender and calling it flattering, and the small cluster of guests within earshot understood the translation instantly, the way a fluent speaker understands an insult delivered in a foreign tongue that the target alone cannot parse, and a ripple of amusement passed through them, not loud, not universal, but enough. Iris felt the old catalogue rise in her, unbidden, the dozen replies that would have devastated Seraphina where she stood, observations about borrowed confidence and inherited charm, and the particular loneliness of a woman who required an audience in order to feel clever at all, and she let every one of them pass unspoken, because a blade sheathed was still a blade, and there was a particular satisfaction, she had learned, in being the only person in a conversation who knew exactly how much damage she was choosing not to do. "How kind of you to notice," she said instead. "My mother always told me a woman who dresses to be remembered is usually trying to make up for something she cannot mend." It was not an insult. It could not be called an insult by anyone repeating it afterward, and yet the fault of the exchange had been neatly, invisibly relocated from Iris's plain gown to Seraphina's bright one, and something in Seraphina's smile tightened by a fraction too small to name and too large to hide entirely. The Dowager Duchess arrived at Iris's elbow within the minute, drawn, as she was always drawn, to any moment where her particular talent for solicitous cruelty might find an audience worthy of it, and she laid 2 fingers on Iris's wrist with the light, proprietary touch of a woman inspecting furniture she had not chosen but was obliged to display. "My dear," she said, "is everything quite all right? There have been such stories this week about the state of the accounts at Larkspur Row. One hears the strangest things from tradesmen." It was not a question. It arrived dressed as concern, phrased with the particular gentleness reserved for invalids and simpletons, and every guest within range understood it as precisely what it was. An accusation of mismanagement delivered with such tender sympathy that Iris could not so much as bristle without appearing to confirm it. The dowager's cruelty had never once needed to raise its voice. It had status enough to whisper and be heard across a ballroom. The particular privilege of a woman whose disapproval had never in 40 years cost her a single invitation. And Iris understood. Watching the older woman's face arrange itself into an expression of maternal worry that touched nothing behind the eyes, that she was watching a performance staged for an audience of dozens, in which Iris herself was merely the prop required to make the performance make sense. "Everything is entirely as it should be," Iris said. "Thank you for your concern. Though I confess I'm always a little sorry to hear that tradesmen have more interesting stories to tell than the truth usually allows them." The reply cost her nothing and gave the dowager nothing to repeat with satisfaction, and a soft laugh went round the small circle that had gathered, quickly stifled, because open amusement at the Dowager Duchess's expense was its own kind of social suicide. But it had happened, and Iris had heard it, and she filed the sound away the way she filed everything, quietly, for later the way her mother had once taught her to save good thread, even from a garment long past mending, because you never knew, in this life, what small thing might yet prove useful. It was the dowager who delivered the evening's true wound, some minutes later, once the small crowd had begun to disperse toward the card room, and the string quartet had struck up something livelier. And she did it not to Iris's face, but in a voice deliberately pitched to carry from 3 feet away, to a companion Iris had never troubled to learn the name of, a widow of some minor consequence, whose chief social function appeared to be serving as an audience for opinions, too. Indelicate to state directly. "One does wonder," the dowager said, with the particular carrying softness of a woman who knows exactly how far her voice travels in a crowded room, "why my son bothered marrying at all, when a convenient arrangement of a rather different kind would have cost him so much less trouble and produced, one imagines, considerably more gratitude." The words landed in the space between Iris's ribs, where such words always landed, and she did not turn. She did not lower her head. She did not give the room the satisfaction of watching her absorb it, and instead she reached, without conscious decision, into her reticule, closed her gloved fingers around the small, hard shape of the rosewood workbox, and held it there, unseen. The way a person holds a stone in a current to keep from being swept downstream, while around her the party resumed its bright, indifferent noise exactly as it always did, the orchestra sliding into a waltz, laughter rising somewhere near the punch table, no one pausing, no one turning, the whole glittering machine of the evening rolling forward over the small private wound it had just inflicted, as though wounds of that size were simply part of the floor it was built on, expected, absorbed, unremarkable, she thought, with the particular clarity that came to her only in moments like this one, that she had spent 2 years being spoken of in a room as though she were furniture that occasionally required dusting, and that furniture at least was not expected to smile through the process. She did not see the Duke arrive, because she had learned, over 2 years, not to watch the doorway for him. A discipline that had cost her a great deal in the early months, and cost her almost nothing now, but she felt the room's temperature shift a second time, more sharply than it had for Seraphina, more sharply even than it had for the dowager. The particular silence that settled over a crowd when a man both feared and admired stepped into it. Conversation not merely thinning, but folding inward, postures straightening the way flowers turn to follow a light they have been trained, against their own instinct, to worship. Alistair Vane crossed the room the way he did everything, without apparent hurry and without a single wasted motion. His expression arranged in the cool, unreadable stillness that had earned him, among the ton's less charitable wits, the private nickname of the Winter Duke, a title he had never once acknowledged and never once, so far as Iris had observed, bothered to dispute. He did not seek her out immediately. That, too, was familiar, the particular geometry of their public appearances together, in which he circulated first among the men of consequence, exchanged the necessary courtesies, and arrived at his wife's side only once duty had cleared a path for him to do so without appearing to have hurried. But when he did arrive, he arrived in time to hear the tail end of the dowager's companion repeating, with the particular relish of a woman handling gossip too good to keep, the observation about convenient arrangements and gratitude, and something in his stillness changed by a margin so small that Iris, who had spent 2 years learning to read him the way one learns to read weather from the color of a distant sky, was perhaps the only person in the room who noticed it at all. He said nothing directly to his mother. He did not need to. He turned to Iris, offered his arm with the same brisk correctness he offered it every time they appeared together in public, and said, in a voice pitched low enough that only she and the dowager's companion could hear it, "My wife manages 3 accounts I could not balance myself, and a garden my own steward, called a lost cause 2 summers ago. I find gratitude an interesting word to apply to the person doing the managing. It was not warmth, exactly. It did not sound like warmth, delivered as it was in the same dry, unhurried register he used to discuss weather or investments, but it was the first time in 2 years he had defended her in front of witnesses, the first time he had named, aloud and specifically, a thing she had done rather than a thing she merely was, and Iris felt something in her chest that she did not have a ready word for, not admiration exactly. Not yet, but something adjacent to it, a small, unfamiliar warmth in a region of herself she had long since stopped expecting anyone to reach. The dowager's companion had the good sense to color and look away. The dowager herself did not so much as blink, merely inclined her head with the serene, untroubled grace of a woman who had never in her life required the last word to feel she had won an argument. But the room had heard, and a room that had heard would remember, and Iris understood, taking her husband's arm and allowing herself to be led toward the card room, that something small and structural had just shifted beneath the evening's surface, the way ice shifts beneath a frozen river long before anyone standing on it feels the crack. By the following morning, the incident had already begun the particular transmutation by which society converted a private moment into public currency, arriving at Larkspur Row by way of Aunt Winifred Colston, who had not herself attended the Bellamy Square gathering, but had heard of it within hours from 3 separate sources and considered it her particular duty. As the aunt who had arranged the marriage in the first place, to deliver both the news and her opinion of it over breakfast, Iris had not invited her to share. Aunt Winifred had been Iris's mother's elder sister, a woman of narrow means and narrower patience, who had managed, in the 2 years since Iris's marriage, to secure for herself a standing invitation to dine at Larkspur Row twice weekly. A small quarterly allowance she referred to only as her niece's natural generosity, and an unshakable conviction that any discomfort Iris experienced in her marriage was a debt owed for services rendered. "Well," said Aunt Winifred, settling into the good chair by the window with the particular proprietary comfort of a woman inspecting a house she considered partly her own achievement, "I hear the Duke made quite a scene defending you last night. You must be very pleased, though I do hope you were careful not to seem too pleased. Men dislike a wife who appears to expect their good opinion." The words arrived, as Aunt Winifred's words always arrived, wrapped in the soft paper of affection, with something considerably less soft folded inside, and Iris had long since learned to unwrap them without comment, the way one learns to eat a fish riddled with small bones, carefully, without ever quite trusting the next bite. "I shall try to contain myself," Iris said, and Aunt Winifred laughed as though this were the wittiest thing she had heard all week, and reached for the last of the toast without asking, because it had never once occurred to Aunt Winifred that a debt of gratitude, once incurred, was ever meant to be considered paid. The weeks that followed settled into the particular rhythm Iris had come to recognize as the shape her marriage was slowly, almost imperceptibly, beginning to take. A rhythm built not from grand gestures, but from small accumulating deviations from the pattern of the 2 years prior. the Duke's visits to Larkspur Row, which had numbered perhaps twice a month since their wedding, began arriving with greater frequency, though never so often as to draw comment, and never announced beforehand, so that Iris would look up from the estate's tangled correspondence to find him already standing in the doorway of the small study she had claimed as her own, watching her with an expression she could not quite name before he schooled it into something more neutral. He had a habit, she began to notice, of asking her opinion on matters he had not asked her opinion on before. The wording of a letter to his solicitor, the wisdom of a particular investment, the character of a tenant petitioning for relief, questions he could easily have answered himself or put to his steward. And though he never once acknowledged that he was testing the water of her judgment against his own, Iris understood perfectly well what she was watching, a man discovering, by inches and against what appeared to be considerable internal resistance, that the wife he had married for convenience possessed a mind he had simply never troubled to consult. It was not admiration, not yet, but it was recognition, and recognition, Iris was beginning to learn, was a stranger and more dangerous gift than admiration would have been, because admiration asked nothing of a person, and recognition asked everything. The terrifying vulnerability of being seen clearly by someone whose opinion had somehow, without her permission, come to matter. Every kindness in that house had always required translation before Iris trusted it, and this was no different, and she found herself watching her husband's small, unexplained attentions the way one watches a sky that has been fair too long, waiting for the shift in pressure that would explain it. The aphorism proved itself smaller and larger than she had expected the following month at a dinner given by Great-Aunt Honoria, the Dowager Marchioness of Esk, a formidable relation of the Duke's whose age had long since bought her the privilege of saying precisely what she thought at any table she graced, a privilege she exercised with the gleeful thoroughness of a woman who had spent 70 years being polite and had decided, somewhere past 60, that she had more than paid for the right to stop. Great-Aunt Honoria had taken one look at Iris across the soup course on the occasion of their first meeting some months prior, and pronounced, to the visible discomfort of half the table, that here at last was a vain wife, with sense enough to be worth the name. A judgment delivered before Iris had said more than a dozen words in her presence, and never once revised in the months since, a peculiar and startling kind of loyalty that asked for no proof because it had never required any. It is a rare thing, Great-Aunt Honoria observed that evening, addressing the table at large but looking directly at Iris, to find a woman in this family who manages a household rather than merely decorating one. My nephew's father married a decoration, God rest him, and spent 30 years discovering the difference between a house and a home. I should hope the current Duke has better sense, though sense does tend to run thin in that particular branch. It was, by any measure, an extraordinary thing to say at a dinner table, and the Dowager Duchess, seated at the far end, went very still in the particular way that meant a great deal was being suppressed, but Great-Aunt Honoria merely returned to her soup with the placid satisfaction of a woman who had said exactly what she intended and felt no further obligation to the moment. Later, once the ladies had withdrawn and the men remained over their port, Great-Aunt Honoria drew Iris aside near the window with a directness that startled her still, 2 years into a marriage that had taught her to expect indirection from every quarter, and said, not unkindly, "You carry yourself like a woman waiting for permission to take up space, child. And I should tell you now that permission is not coming. You will have to simply begin taking it." Iris had no ready answer for this, and Great-Aunt Honoria, seeming to expect none, patted her hand once and moved on to harangue a footman about the temperature of the drawing-room, leaving Iris alone by the window with the strange sensation of having been for the first time in longer than she could easily remember, entirely and unconditionally believed in by someone who had asked for no evidence at all. It was Lady Beatrice Vane, the Duke's younger sister, newly returned from a term abroad, and possessed of a warmth her brother and mother had somehow both failed to pass along to her, who first said the thing Iris had spent 2 years refusing to think in full sentences. They had grown close over the preceding weeks in the particular quick way that sometimes happens between women who recognize in each other a shared exhaustion with the same performances, and Beatrice had taken to calling at Larkspur Row, unannounced, curling into the window seat of Iris's study with the unself-conscious ease of a girl who had not yet learned to fear rooms the way her elder relations had taught themselves to, and it was there, one gray afternoon with rain streaking the glass behind her, that she set down her teacup, studied Iris with the particular perceptiveness she wore lightly, like a coat she did not think much about, and said, "You do know my brother watches you when he thinks no one is watching him watch you." Iris had laughed the observation off, said something about accounts and figures and a husband checking his wife's arithmetic, and Beatrice had smiled the smile of a woman who intended to let the subject rest exactly where she had placed it, confident it would be picked up again later of its own accord, and said only, "Alistair has never once in his life watched anyone's arithmetic with that particular expression, but do go on telling yourself otherwise if it's more comfortable. I shall enjoy watching you discover I was right." She had risen then, gathered her things, and left within the quarter hour, as she always did, offering no further argument, because Beatrice's particular gift lay not in persuading, but in planting a single unanswerable observation and departing before it could be talked away, and Iris had sat alone in the gray afternoon light for a long while afterward. The rosewood workbox open on the desk before her, turning the worn thimble over and over between her fingers without sewing anything at all, aware of a small, unfamiliar, and faintly alarming warmth gathering somewhere beneath her ribs that she did not yet have permission, even from herself, to call by its true name. The letter arrived on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday, delivered among the household's ordinary correspondence with no particular urgency in its plain sealed exterior, and Iris might not have troubled over it at all had she not recognized, from 2 years of managing the household's accounts, the particular stiff formality of a solicitor's hand on the direction. She set it aside for the Duke's attention that evening, as she set aside all matters properly his to handle, and thought little more of it until she saw his face, briefly, unguardedly, as he broke the seal after dinner, a flicker of something that might have been irritation, or might have been the particular blankness of a man refusing to let irritation show. Gone again before she could name it with any certainty. "It is nothing that concerns you," he said when she asked, folding the letter with the crisp economy he brought to everything, merely a matter of business requiring attention, and Iris, who had learned 2 years ago not to press where her husband chose to close a door, let the subject go, though, she noted, with the small private vigilance that had kept her steady through worse uncertainties than this one, that he had not answered the question she had actually asked, only the one he had preferred to hear, and that the letter, once folded, had gone into his coat rather than onto the desk where matters of no consequence were usually left for her to file, and that he had, for the remainder of the evening, been quieter than his custom, watching the fire with the particular stillness of a man doing sums he did not care to share the results of, and Iris, watching him in turn from across the small sitting room at Larkspur Row, felt the faint, familiar prickle of a house settling its weight before a storm it had not yet announced. The letter did not surface again for 3 days, folded wherever the Duke had chosen to keep it, and Iris did not ask after it a second time, having learned long ago that pressing a closed door in that household rarely opened it, and often only confirmed, for whoever stood watching, how much she wanted it opened. She filled the interval instead with the small, steady work that had always been her particular armor against uncertainty: the estate's spring accounts, a hem let down for Beatrice's youngest cousin, an hour each evening with the rosewood workbox open on her knee, not sewing so much as simply holding the familiar weight of it while she thought, and it was during one of those quiet evenings that the Duke found her. Arriving unannounced, as he had begun to do with increasing regularity, and stood a moment in the study doorway, watching her before she noticed him at all. "You keep that box near you the way other women keep smelling salts," he observed, not quite a question, and Iris, startled into more honesty than she generally allowed herself in his presence, said it was her mother's, one of the only things that was, and he crossed the room and sat, without invitation, in the chair opposite hers, and asked, in the dry, unhurried tone that made every question he asked sound like an idle one even when it plainly was not, what sort of woman your mother was. "Practical," Iris said after a moment. "She used to say a house built by another's hand was never quite your own, and something about sewing your own seams, because borrowed thread always pulls loose, and I did not understand it as a child, and I am not entirely certain I understand it now, except that I have never once forgotten it." The Duke considered this in silence long enough that Iris began to regret having offered so much of herself into a room that had never asked for it, and then he said, quietly, "That sounds like a woman who did not trust anyone to hold up their end of an arrangement," and Iris said, evenly, that her mother had had very good reasons not to. And the Duke's mouth had done something then that was not quite a smile, and he had said nothing further, but he had stayed another quarter hour past the length his usual visits required, discussing nothing of consequence, the state of the roads, a horse he was considering purchasing, and had left, at the end of it, with the particular, unhurried reluctance of a man leaving somewhere he had not entirely wanted to leave, and Iris had sat a long while after the door closed behind him, turning the thimble over in her palm, aware of the small, treacherous warmth that had begun, against every instruction she had given herself, to settle permanently somewhere beneath her sternum whenever he was in the room. It was not admiration yet. She was careful, in the privacy of her own mind, to withhold that word a while longer, the way one withholds a verdict until all the evidence has arrived. But it was recognition, unmistakably, and recognition had begun to run in both directions between them with an evenness that frightened her rather more than his earlier coldness ever had. Because coldness asked nothing of her, and this asked everything, the slow, unbearable vulnerability of being seen by someone whose seeing had somehow, without her consent, come to matter more than anyone else's in the room. At the Ashworth Musicale the following week, she watched him defend her a second time, more precisely than the first, when Seraphina, in a burst of performed wit that earned its usual partial, ungenerous laughter, wondered aloud whether a woman raised on household accounts rather than dancing masters could really be expected to know a minuet from a march, and the Duke, without raising his voice, without appearing to hurry, replied that he had never once required a wife who danced well. Only one who could be trusted to know precisely where every shilling in his house had gone, and added, after the smallest, deliberate pause, that he found the second skill considerably rarer in his acquaintance than the first. It was not a large cruelty toward Seraphina. It did not need to be large to land, and Iris, watching the flush climb Seraphina's throat before she mastered it, understood that her husband had learned, somewhere in the preceding weeks, precisely how to wound with the same deniable elegance the Tun had always used against his wife, and had chosen, for reasons Iris did not yet trust herself to name, to spend that particular skill in her defense rather than against her. The eviction notice, when it finally announced itself in full, did not arrive with the drama such news properly deserved. It arrived instead on an ordinary Thursday morning, delivered by a clerk from the letting agent's office, who stood in the front hall of Larkspur Row, turning his hat in his hands, with the miserable discomfort of a man who has been sent to deliver bad news to his betters and would very much rather be anywhere else, and explained, in halting, apologetic phrases, that the lease on the house had lapsed the previous quarter day, that repeated notices had gone unanswered at Bellamy Square, that the owner, a Mr. Aldous Price, had been more than patient given the family's rank, but had, in the absence of any renewal or reply, already accepted an offer from another tenant for the following month, and that her Grace would need to vacate within a fortnight unless some arrangement could be reached immediately. Iris heard the words with the particular clarity that comes to a person only in the first few seconds of genuine shock, before the mind has had time to soften anything, and she did not cry out, and she did not sit down, though her knees had gone strangely light, and she thanked the clerk for his trouble in a voice that surprised her with its steadiness, and saw him out, and stood a long moment in the front hall of the only home that had ever, in 2 years, felt remotely her own, understanding with a slow, sick clarity that her husband had simply forgotten her. Not unkindly, not cruelly, simply the way a man forgets an umbrella left in another room, an object useful in its season and invisible the rest of the year. And the word the ton had given her rose up now and struck her from an angle she had not braced for, because a convenient arrangement, it turned out, was one that required no active cruelty to fail, only neglect. Only the small, ordinary carelessness of a man with larger matters pressing on his attention, a Royal Commission appointment reportedly under discussion at his club for weeks, a father's debts still being untangled from 3 counties away, a mother whose demands on his time had only sharpened since the Bellamy Square dinner where he had first defended his wife in public. He had not chosen to hurt her. He had simply not chosen her at all, in the moment it mattered, and Iris found, standing alone in the hall with the clerk's footsteps fading down the front steps, that the second kind of wound cut a good deal deeper than the first. Because there was no one to blame for it, no villain to despise. Only the plain arithmetic of a woman who had never quite risen high enough in anyone's accounting to be remembered when the reckoning came due. By evening, the whole of polite London seemed somehow already to know it, in the particular uncanny way scandal traveled faster than any post could carry it, and Aunt Winifred arrived at Larkspur Row before the dinner hour, in a state of barely contained alarm that had less to do, Iris suspected, with sympathy than with the sudden vulnerability of her own quarterly allowance. "How could you let this happen?" Aunt Winifred demanded, settling into the good chair without removing her bonnet, as though the omission were entirely Iris's to have prevented, and Iris, summoning the last of a patience worn thinner than she liked to admit, said only that she had not, in fact, been consulted on the matter of the lease at any point in the 2 years of its existence. A fact Aunt Winifred received with the particular deafness of a woman who preferred not to hear inconvenient truths that complicated a grievance already comfortably assigned. It was not accusation, precisely, the way Aunt Winifred meant it. It was worse than accusation, because it arrived dressed as worry, the same soft paper Aunt Winifred always wrapped her demands in, and beneath the paper, unmistakably, lay the old familiar pressure that Iris ought to be grateful for whatever scraps of stability the marriage still afforded her, ought not to make trouble, ought to smile and wait and trust that a duke's forgetfulness would eventually correct itself if she were only patient and convenient enough about the waiting. Iris thought of the dozen replies that would have devastated Aunt Winifred, where she sat, precise observations about debts paid and gratitude demanded, and the particular arithmetic of a woman who had never once, in 2 years, offered anything but her opinion at another's expense, and let every one of them go unspoken. Because she had come to understand. A particular power in being the only person in a room who knew exactly how much damage she was declining to do. She did not wait for her husband. This was the decision that arrived in her, not as a sudden resolve, but as something that had apparently been assembling itself quietly for 2 years without her full permission, the way a wall is built one unremarked brick at a time, until the day someone notices it has become load-bearing, and it announced itself to her not as hope, not as anger, but as a single flat, private sentence that required no further deliberation. She would not wait on a hand that would not thread the needle. She had spent 2 years listening to a house call her convenient, had spent 2 years being managed rather than consulted, had spent 2 years watching her own considerable competence flow, unwitnessed and uncredited, into an arrangement that remembered her only when it needed something balanced, and she found, standing in the study with the rosewood workbox open before her, that she no longer had any appetite for waiting to be rescued by a man too occupied with the shape of his own future to notice the roof over hers. What almost no one in London knew, because Iris had taken particular and deliberate care that no one should, was that for the better part of 2 years she had been earning money of her own, quietly, methodically, in the one currency the ton would never have credited her with possessing. Madame Verrier, whose Bond Street establishment dressed half the fashionable women in town in embroidery so fine it was frequently mistaken for imported French work, had discovered Iris's talent for pattern and stitch entirely by accident, through a length of work Iris had done for her own gowns, and never intended to sell, and had offered, with the particular brisk discretion of a woman who understood exactly what she was asking, a standing arrangement, designs delivered unsigned, payment made quietly through a lawyer who asked no questions, credit given entirely and exclusively to Madame Verrier's own celebrated name. Iris had accepted without hesitation, not for the money alone, though the money had mattered enormously to a woman whose personal allowance from her husband's estate would not have covered a season's gloves, but for the small, private, entirely uncredited satisfaction of doing work that was unmistakably, indisputably hers, in a world that had otherwise decided her worth began and ended with the word convenient. She had banked nearly every shilling of it. She had told no one, not her husband, not Aunt Winifred, not even Beatrice, because a secret told was a secret that could be taken, and she had learned, at 14, watching her mother's small savings absorbed one by one into her father's debts, precisely how quickly a woman's private resources could be reclassified, by any man with sufficient authority, as belonging to someone else entirely. She went, the following morning, not to her husband, but to Great-Aunt Honoria, because instinct told her, correctly, that the old Marchioness would ask for no explanation before offering her help, and would ask no questions afterward that Iris did not wish to answer, and she was not disappointed. Great-Aunt Honoria heard the whole of it, the lapsed lease, the fortnight's notice, the years of quiet, unsigned needlework, without once interrupting, and when Iris finished, the old woman set down her tea, regarded her for a long moment with an expression Iris could not entirely read, and said only, "Well, it's about time someone in this family did something sensible with money instead of simply losing it. How much do you have, and how much do you need?" The sum Iris had saved fell short of the full purchase price Mr. Kryman, Price's solicitor, eventually named, though not by so wide a margin as she had feared, and Great-Aunt Honoria supplied the remainder without ceremony, waving off Iris's attempt at formal terms of repayment with the brisk observation that she had considerably more money than sense at her age, and would rather see it spent making one clever woman independent than see it divided, eventually, among relations who had never once thanked her for anything. Within 4 days, working through a solicitor of her own, choosing rather than the estates, Iris had done what no one in either family had thought to imagine a duke's convenient wife capable of doing. She had bought the house. The freehold of Larkspur Row, purchased outright, in her own name, with her own money, stood now not as a leased convenience granted at her husband's forgetful pleasure, but as the first thing in 2 years of marriage that belonged entirely and unambiguously to Iris alone. And when she signed the final paper, her hand steady, the solicitor's clerk watching with poorly concealed astonishment, she thought of her mother guiding her clumsy fingers through a hem by tallow light and felt, for the first time in longer than she could remember, the particular clean satisfaction of a debt finally, fully repaid, not to any person, but to a girl of 14, who had once watched everything she loved be quietly reassigned to someone else's account. The Duke learned of it not from his wife, but from his own solicitor, 3 days later, a circumstance that did nothing to soften the particular expression on his face when he arrived at Larkspur Row that evening, unannounced, and found Iris in the study exactly where he generally found her, and said, without preamble, that he understood congratulations were in order, though he confessed himself curious as to when his wife had acquired both a fortune and a solicitor without troubling to mention either. It was not warmth. It arrived instead in the clipped, controlled register she had learned to associate with genuine feeling in him, the coldness that was not coldness at all, but its opposite, banked too carefully to show its true temperature. And Iris, who had spent a great deal of the preceding days rehearsing precisely this conversation, found that none of her rehearsed answers survived contact with the actual look on his face. "I did not think it was yours to be consulted on," she said, "since you had already forgotten it was yours to attend to," and the words landed harder than she had intended, though she found, watching them land, that she did not entirely regret their weight. He was silent a long moment. "You might have come to me," he said finally, and something in his voice had thinned, not with anger exactly, but with something adjacent to it, wounded, and trying very hard not to sound wounded. "I did come to you," Iris said, 2 years ago, when I married you, and I have been coming to you, in one fashion or another, ever since, in every account I balanced, and every garden I mended, and every evening I sat in this room, waiting to see whether you would remember I existed outside of it. And I find I have grown tired of being the only one who arrives." It was not shouted. It was delivered in the same level, restrained voice she had used against the Dowager, and against Seraphina, and against Aunt Winifred, the voice that had carried her through 2 years of being managed rather than seen, and something in the Duke's stillness broke apart, briefly, at the sound of it, a flicker crossing his face too quick to name, before he mastered it back into its usual composure, and he said, more quietly, "I did not forget you. I forgot a piece of paper, which is not the same thing, though I understand why you cannot be expected to feel the difference." "It is precisely the same thing," Iris said, to the person left standing in the house when the paper runs out, and he had no answer to that, and stood instead a long moment simply looking at her, in a way he had not quite looked at her before, as though some inventory he had been keeping of her for 2 years had just been forced to add a column he had not previously accounted for, and then he had left, without further argument, and Iris had stood alone in the study a long while afterward, aware that something between them had shifted violently, and would not, whatever came next, shift entirely back. The scandal note appeared in the gossip columns within the week, unsigned, delivered anonymously to 3 of the more indiscreet publications that fed on precisely this sort of story, and its contents were considerably worse than mere embarrassment. "One does wonder," it began, in a phrase Iris recognized before she had finished the first line, "by what means a duchess of modest fortune and modester connections came suddenly into sufficient funds to purchase freehold property in her own name, without her husband's knowledge. One does wonder indeed what manner of gentleman's generosity might explain so sudden and so private a windfall, and one does wonder, further, whether the Duke of Renwick's forthcoming appointment to the commission ought not to prompt rather more scrutiny of his household's domestic arrangements than has thus far been afforded them." It was not an accusation of theft. It was worse than theft, because it implied, with the particular oily indirection the profile of cruelty in that world always preferred, that Iris had obtained her fortune through impropriety, through some undisclosed gentleman's patronage, the sort of arrangement that would ruin not merely her own reputation, but her husband's standing before the very commission whose confidence his appointment depended upon, and the note landed in London's drawing rooms within a day, with the particular gleeful speed reserved for scandal that implicated the highest ranks. A formal letter arrived at Bellamy Square from one of the Duke's political patrons within 48 hours, couched in the careful, regretful language of men who wished to appear reluctant while making their meaning entirely plain, expressing concern that certain rumors currently circulating regarding the Duchess of Renwick's finances might, if left unaddressed, prove an obstacle to the Commission's confidence in proceeding with the appointment as planned, and requesting, with icy courtesy, some reassurance before the matter progressed further. The stakes, which had begun as a private embarrassment over a lapsed lease, had transformed within a week into something considerably larger, a threat not merely to Iris's standing, but to her husband's entire future, to the appointment he had spent years positioning himself for, to the family name itself, and Iris understood, reading the political letter over the Duke's shoulder in a silence neither of them broke, that whoever had written that anonymous note had aimed with considerably more precision than mere spite required, had understood exactly where the family's true vulnerability lay, and had struck it with the particular surgical cruelty of someone who knew the household intimately enough to know precisely what would hurt it most. Great Aunt Honoria arrived at Larkspur Row the following morning before Iris had finished her tea, having heard the whole affair from 3 separate sources before breakfast, and unlike everyone else in London who had received the news with a raised eyebrow and a delighted whisper, she received it instead with an immediate, unshakable, entirely evidence-free conviction of Iris's innocence that arrived before Iris had even finished explaining the accusation in full. "Nonsense," Great Aunt Honoria said. Before Iris had reached the second sentence, "I have known you 6 months, and I have known that family 60 years, and I know precisely which of the 2 is more likely to have done something underhanded. Now let me see the wretched thing." Iris produced the printed column, and Great Aunt Honoria read it once through in silence, her mouth thinning by degrees, and then read it a second time, more slowly, her finger tracing the opening line, and then set it down on the table between them and said, in the particular flat, dangerous tone of a woman who had just recognized something she wished she had not, "One does wonder." Iris did not immediately understand. Great Aunt Honoria tapped the printed line again, harder, that phrase, "Child, one does wonder." I have heard Augusta open a sentence with those precise 3 words at every dinner table in London for the better part of 30 years. It is as much her signature as her own hand would be. She cannot help herself. It is the verbal equivalent of a woman clearing her throat before she says something she knows she oughtn't. And there it is, printed in a scandal sheet as though it dropped from the sky by accident. Iris felt the room tilt very slightly, the particular vertigo of a small piece of evidence sliding suddenly and completely into place, because she had heard the Dowager Duchess open a sentence with exactly those words herself, more than once, including the very evening at Bellamy Square when she had wondered aloud, in front of witnesses, why her son had bothered marrying at all when a different arrangement would have cost him less trouble. And Iris understood, with the particular clean, cold clarity that comes only at the end of a long private suspicion, that the woman who had allowed the lease notices to gather dust and go unanswered, who had perhaps arranged for them to gather dust in the first place, was very likely the same woman who had, upon discovering how neatly Iris had solved the resulting crisis herself, decided that a scandal was preferable to a wife who had proven, publicly and undeniably, that she needed no rescuing at all. Great Aunt Honoria did not waste the day in speculation. She sent for Beatrice within the hour, and Beatrice, arriving flushed and already half-informed by the general commotion sweeping the family's acquaintance, confirmed within minutes what Iris had begun to suspect, that her mother had in fact handled the household's general correspondence at Bellamy Square during the precise fortnight the renewal notices were meant to have reached the Duke. A duty she had taken up, ostensibly, only to spare her son the tedium of routine business while the commission matter absorbed his attention, and that among the papers Beatrice recalled her mother reviewing that fortnight had been, quite specifically, a bundle from a letting agent's office that the Dowager had set aside with the brisk remark that it could wait. It could wait, Beatrice repeated now, her face gone pale with the particular horror of a daughter discovering her mother capable of something she had always suspected and never quite allowed herself to believe. She said it in front of me. I did not think anything of it at the time. I had no notion what the papers concerned. Great Aunt Honoria, who had never in her life required more evidence than her own certainty demanded, declared the matter settled well before the family solicitor confirmed, through a discreet inquiry to the printer, that the anonymous note had been delivered by a hand belonging to a maid in the Dowager's own service, and summoned a gathering at Bellamy Square that same evening. Ostensibly a family dinner, in fact, something considerably closer to a tribunal. The Dowager Duchess, confronted across her own dining table with the printed column, the maid's identification, and Great Aunt Honoria's flat, immovable recitation of the phrase "one," does wonder repeated back to her 4 times in succession until the repetition itself became a kind of verdict. Did not weep and did not immediately confess, maintaining instead, for a long, brittle stretch of minutes, the same serene composure she had worn through every cruelty of the season, until Great Aunt Honoria said, with the particular devastating mildness of a woman who had already won and knew it, "There it is, Augusta, you have used those same 3 words to open every unkind sentence you have. Spoken at this table for 30 years, I could recite you a dozen occasions. Shall I begin?" And the Dowager's composure, tested finally past its capacity, cracked at last into something that was not quite an apology, but was, unmistakably, an admission, delivered in a voice gone suddenly older than Iris had ever heard it, that she had thought, in letting the lease lapse, in saying nothing when the notices piled unanswered, that she was doing her son a kindness, sparing him a marriage she had never believed suited him, giving the arrangement a graceful and deniable end before it cost the family more than it had already cost, and that when Iris had solved the crisis herself, so neatly, so completely, without a single tremor of the collapse the Dowager had confidently expected, the anonymous note had seemed, in the moment, less like malice than like a final necessary correction to a mistake she still, even now, was not entirely prepared to call her own. It was not forgiveness that filled the silence after she finished speaking. It was something colder and more useful than forgiveness, the particular clean, terrible clarity of an entire household finally seeing, without argument, without deniability, precisely who among them had done the actual harm, and Serafina, seated at the far end of the table, her face gone carefully blank, offered no defense of her aunt and no defense of herself, though, Iris noted, with the flat, exhausted attention of a woman too tired for further catalogues of unsaid retorts, that Serafina's silence in that moment was its own small confession, an admission that she had known, or guessed, or at the very least chosen not to ask, precisely how the notices had come to lapse, and precisely who had profited most from believing they had lapsed by accident. The Duke had said almost nothing throughout the whole of it, sitting very still at the head of his own table while his mother's composure came apart in front of the family she had spent 30 years teaching to fear her, and it was only when the room had begun, awkwardly, to disperse, the dinner abandoned half-eaten, Beatrice slipping away with Great-Aunt Honoria in a silence too heavy for further speech, that he rose and crossed to where Iris still sat, and said, quietly, so that only she could hear it, "I owe you an accounting considerably longer than the ones you have spent 2 years keeping for me." Iris did not answer at once. Outside, the evening had begun to sour into weather, the first low grumble of a storm gathering somewhere beyond the city's rooftops, the windows going dark and restless with the particular electric stillness that precedes rain, and the Duke glanced toward the sound of it, and then back at her, and said, "Will you come with me? There is a room at Larkspur Row I have never once sat in with you properly, and I find I no longer wish to postpone it." And Iris, rising, feeling the old rosewood weight of the workbox pressing faintly against her side where it always hung, understood that whatever accounting he intended to render her tonight would not be delivered across a crowded room, or beneath the watching eyes of a family that had, at last, exhausted its capacity to interfere, and she followed him out into the gathering dark toward the carriage. The first fat drops of rain beginning to strike the pavement around them, and neither of them spoke again the entire way home. The rain had begun in earnest by the time the carriage drew up outside Larkspur Row, striking the cobbles hard enough to bounce, and neither of them spoke as they crossed the few running steps to the door, Iris fumbling briefly with a key that was, for the first time in 2 years, entirely and legally her own to turn, and the small private absurdity of that fact that she must unlock her own house for the Duke of Renwick, as though he were the visitor and she the owner, which she was, struck her with a force that was almost laughter, though nothing about the evening had left room in her for anything so light. The house received them in darkness, the servants long since sent to bed against the storm, and Iris lit a single lamp in the small parlor rather than summon anyone, and the Duke stood a moment just inside the doorway, dripping, watching her do it, with the particular stillness of a man standing somewhere he has visited 100 times, and is only now, for the first time, actually seeing. It had gone past midnight by the mantel clock, nearer 2 than 1, the storm outside throwing itself against the windows in long shuddering gusts that made the small fire gutter and steady, and Iris set the lamp down on the table between them and did not sit. And did not invite him to, and said nothing, because she had decided somewhere in the carriage that she had done enough for one evening of arriving first. He crossed the room to her slowly, in increments so measured she could have marked them, 1 step. A pause in which the thunder rolled somewhere over the rooftops, and neither of them looked away from the other, another step, closer than propriety strictly required, and considerably closer than 2 years of careful distance had ever permitted him to come. "I have spent this entire marriage," he said, and his voice had lost. By degrees, she could hear happening in real time, the flat, unhurried authority it wore in every room that was not this one, until what remained was simply a man's voice, tired and unguarded and younger than she had ever heard it, telling himself the truth of his own arrangement, calling it prudent, calling it sensible, calling it the kind of decision a man in my position is required to make, and I told myself so many times that I nearly believed it, until a fortnight ago when a clerk stood in this house and told my wife she had a fortnight to find somewhere else to live, and I understood, all at once, standing in my own drawing room reading the account of it secondhand, that I had built an entire marriage on being the sort of man who could forget a woman existed and call the forgetting nothing more than paperwork. Iris did not answer immediately. She had spent 2 years cataloging every unspoken reply she had ever owed this family, and she found, now that the moment had finally arrived to spend one of them, that she wanted to spend it correctly. "I did not come here tonight to be forgiven for solving a problem you created," she said, "and I will not pretend the fortnight did not frighten me, because it did, more than I have told anyone. But I find I am no longer the woman who will accept being wanted only when the alternative is losing me entirely." Something crossed his face at that, quick and unguarded, closer to pain than to argument, and he closed the last of the distance between them, near enough now that she could see the reins still clinging to his collar, and said, "I am not here to ask you to accept anything so small as that." "I do not want you to stay," he said, "because you have nowhere else to go, not any longer. You have proven that beyond any argument I could offer. You built yourself a door out of this marriage, and I will not insult you by pretending otherwise. I do not want you to stay, because it would spare us both a scandal, because I find, to my own considerable surprise, that I no longer care what my mother's circle makes of either of us, and a man who has spent his whole life caring rather too much what circles make of him finds that a stranger thing to say than you might imagine." "I do not want you to stay," he said, and here his voice caught briefly on something he did not immediately master, because it is expected of us, because a duke requires a duchess the way a house requires a roof, because I have never once, in 2 years, given you a reason that was actually about you rather than about what a wife was supposed to supply. He stopped. The fire cracked once, settling, and outside the storm threw another long roll of thunder against the glass, and Iris waited because she had learned, across 2 years of reading this particular silence, that his truest sentences always arrived last, after every easier one had been spent. "I want you to stay," he said finally, "because a fortnight ago this house stood dark and I did not know, for 2 entire days, whether you would still be in it when I came looking, and I discovered, in those 2 days, that I had built my whole life around being a man other people needed, and had never once considered what it would be to need someone myself, and I find that I do. I need you. Not the accounts you balance, or the garden you mended, or the scandal you disproved, but you, in a room, existing, choosing to remain in it because you wish to, and not because any paper obliges you to." "Will you stay?" he said, not as an arrangement anyone could call convenient, but as my wife in truth, chosen new every morning rather than assumed the way a man assumes the weather, and Iris felt the old catalogue of caution rise in her one final time. Every reason 2 years of restraint had taught her to withhold an answer and let it go, deliberately, the way a hand finally opens around a stone it has carried a long while through moving water. She did not answer at once, because she had promised herself, somewhere in the carriage, that she would not surrender the ground she had spent 2 years earning, simply because the man asking finally sounded like he meant it, and so she said, instead, "Before I answer you, I should like to know that you understand what you are asking, because I will not be managed into gratitude twice in one life. I have spent 2 years being useful, and I find I have grown tired of the word, and if what you are offering me tonight is only a better decorated version of convenient, I would rather keep my own house and my own name on the deed and let you find your gratitude somewhere else." It was not accusation. It was. She understood even as she said it, the clearest and most honest sentence she had spoken to him in 2 years, and he received it not with the flinch she had half expected, but with something closer to relief, as though he had been waiting, without knowing it, for someone to finally hold him to a standard worth meeting. "I am not asking you to be useful," he said. "I am asking you to be wanted, in a house, by a man who has finally learned the difference, and I will not pretend I learned it quickly or well, but I have learned it now, and I would like the chance to prove it slowly, for as long as it takes, rather than all at once tonight." "Then say why," Iris said. "Not the reasons you have already given me, but the one reason underneath all of them." And he was quiet a long moment, the fire settling lower, the storm easing by degrees outside, as though it too had begun listening for his answer. And when he spoke again, his voice had gone entirely unguarded, stripped down past rank and past caution to something that sounded, for the first time in 2 years, simply like a man telling the truth, because he no longer had the strength to do otherwise. "Because when no one is watching," he said, "when there is no ballroom to perform for, and no mother counting the cost of the marriage, and no ledger requiring balance, I still want you in the room. I have wanted you in the room for months, and called it something else, and I am done calling it something else." "Yes," Iris said, "because I wish it," and the words left her lighter than she had expected, not a surrender, but a decision, freely made, in a room that belonged, for once, entirely to her. He crossed the last small distance between them and took her hand, not with the formal, correct grip he had offered her 100 times across 2 years of public appearances, but simply the way one person takes another's hand when there is no audience left to perform the gesture for. And he did not let it go, not when she turned to set the lamp lower, not when the fire burned down to its final embers, not when the storm outside finally began, by slow degrees to exhaust itself against the windows. And Iris felt sometime in the small hours the particular pressure building behind her eyes that she had not permitted herself in 2 years of composure. And did not fight it this time, and let the tears come, quietly, without collapse, without apology, because it was not grief surfacing, but something truer and harder to name. 2 years of careful suppression finally reaching air, and the Duke did not attempt to hush her or manage the moment into something more comfortable for himself, only tightened his hand around hers and waited, the way a person waits out whether they have finally stopped pretending they can control. And when it passed, as it did, she found her hand still held, unclaimed by either of them for any reason except that neither wished to let it go. And outside, at last, the storm had begun to break, the first gray seam of a coming dawn showing faint along the horizon past the rooftops. The rain gentling to something that sounded, against the glass, almost like the ordinary rhythm of any quiet spring morning arriving on schedule, indifferent to the storm that had preceded it, and entirely unaware of what it had just been asked to witness. A year turned over, as years do, without asking anyone's permission to pass more gently than the one before it, and Larkspur Row, by the following spring, had become something London had not expected, and had, by increments too gradual for any single gossip column to properly credit, come around to admiring. Iris had not sold the house, and had not folded it back into the estate's larger holdings the way convention might have suggested, but had instead, with Great Aunt Honoria's enthusiastic backing and Beatrice's tireless recruiting among their wider acquaintance, converted its ground floor into a working atelier, modest in its beginnings and considerable in its ambition, where seamstresses who had spent their careers stitching other women's names onto their own finest work were paid, for the first time in most of their lives, under contracts that named them plainly on every commission that left the door. Madame Verrier herself, once the arrangement's terms were properly explained to her, had proven a surprisingly willing partner rather than a rival, having grown, over the years of Iris's unsigned work, into a genuine if unspoken respect for the woman whose talent had quietly built half her reputation, and the two of them together, Duchess and Modiste, had built something the Ton had never quite seen before. A house of fine needlework where the hands that did the work were finally permitted to be known for it. The opening, that spring, drew a crowd considerably larger and considerably more fashionable than anyone at Larkspur Row had dared to predict, filling the small square outside with carriages until the street itself seemed to hold its breath, and Iris, standing at the center of a room she had built with her own two hands, out of nothing but savings and stubbornness and a mother's half-understood aphorism, watched doubt convert itself, guest by guest, into something considerably warmer. Women who had once called her convenient now leaning close over the display tables asking, with genuine and unguarded admiration, who had done this particular pattern, who had thought of that particular stitch, and being told, plainly, by name, for the first time in the whole history of that trade, precisely whose hands deserved the credit. The Dowager Duchess did not attend. Her influence, once vast enough to shape a room's mood before she had crossed its threshold, had thinned considerably in the year since the truth of the lease had come to light, not through any public punishment, which the family had quietly agreed would serve no one, but through the slower, more permanent erosion of a woman whose word could no longer be trusted the way it once had been, invitations arriving a little less promptly, opinions solicited a little less often, the particular authority of 30 years' unchallenged cruelty draining away by the same small increments through which it had originally been built. Seraphina had married, that winter, a baronet of respectable but unremarkable fortune, a match considerably beneath what the Ton had once assumed awaited her, and had removed largely from London society thereafter, her wit once so admired, having lost most of its audience once the family whose favor had amplified it declined to keep amplifying it further. Aunt Winifred still called twice weekly and still angled with undiminished persistence for whatever small advantage the visit might yield her, but Iris had long since stopped mistaking the woman's affection for anything requiring repayment, and found she could receive her now with something almost like fondness, the particular ease of a person no longer afraid of being managed. It was the Duke who insisted, against Iris's own more modest instincts, that the atelier's opening close with some public word from him, and Iris had argued against it for the better part of a week, certain the gesture would read as exactly the kind of performance her whole life had trained her to distrust, and had relented only when Great-Aunt Honoria, with her usual bluntness, informed her that a man who had spent 30 years letting a room's silence do his talking for him had finally decided to use his voice for something worth saying, and that it would be a particular kind of foolishness to deny him the chance simply because the old Iris would not have trusted it. So it was that, near the close of the afternoon, with the square outside still crowded and the atelier's ground floor packed shoulder to shoulder with the very society that had once called his wife nothing more than a convenient arrangement, Alistair Vane, Duke of Renwick, climbed 2 steps onto a small dais that had been arranged, ostensibly for the display of finished work, and the room, sensing something was about to happen, did what rooms in that world always did before a man of his rank spoke, folding inward, conversation dying by degrees, glasses lowering, a held collective breath settling over the crowd the way weather settles before it breaks. 2 years ago, he said, and his voice, though pitched to carry, had none of the cold, unreadable authority the Ton had spent a decade learning to fear. I married a woman this city agreed to call convenient, and I want to say plainly, in front of everyone who ever used that word in my hearing, that they were wrong. He let the word sit a moment, in the silence he had built for it. "They were wrong," he said again. Because a convenient woman does not quietly save an evening from ruin with a folded card wedged under a failing table leg and let no one ever know her name for it. They were wrong, because a convenient woman does not build, out of nothing but 2 years' careful saving and a mother's old advice about borrowed thread, a house that now pays honest women honestly for work this city has spent a century stealing from them, without a second thought. "They were wrong," he said, and his voice caught once on something he did not try to hide. Because a convenient woman does not teach a man who thought himself finished learning anything that the whole of his rank and his fortune and his careful reputation were worth considerably less than 1 honest hour of her company, and I was the last person in this city to understand that, though I had, in fairness, the most opportunity of anyone here to learn it sooner. He looked at her then, across the crowded room, and the applause that followed was not the qualified, half-amused sound the ton usually offered its cleverest wits, not universal because such rooms never gave anything so freely, but wide and warm and unmistakably genuine, rising from women who had once whispered the word convenient behind their fans and now found themselves, without quite deciding to, clapping for the woman it had never once truly described. She was patient, the Duke went on, once the applause allowed him room again, when patience cost her more than any of us troubled to notice. She was skilled, in a trade this room only respects when it forgets to ask whose hands did the work. And she was, every single day I failed to see it, entirely and completely worth believing in. And I hope, whatever any of us builds after today, that this house remains standing long past the two of us, so that some other woman this city decides to underestimate will have somewhere to prove, in her own time and her own way, exactly how wrong that judgment always was. Iris did not remember crossing the room afterward, only that she was suddenly beside him, and that he took her hand in front of everyone this time, without hesitation, without the old careful correctness that had once governed every public gesture between them, and did not let it go, and the crowd's warmth folded around the two of them the way it had once, at Bellamy Square, folded around every cruelty she had learned to absorb, without flinching, except that this time the warmth was real, and this time it was hers to keep. She thought, standing there with her hand in his and the low golden light of the late afternoon, slanting through the atelier's tall windows, of the girl who had once sat by tallow candlelight learning to sew a hem she could not yet properly manage, of the sentence that girl had not understood and had carried anyway, "Sew your own seams, Iris, borrowed thread always pulls loose," and understood now, fully, standing in a house she had built with her own 2 hands and a marriage she had chosen, freely, a second time, that her mother had not been teaching her merely to mend a garment. She had been teaching her, all along, how to build a life sturdy enough that no one else's negligence could ever again leave her standing in an empty room, wondering whether she had been forgotten. It was not a perfect marriage that had emerged from that long, slow-burning year, and Iris had stopped expecting perfection somewhere around the fortnight she had spent, not knowing where she would sleep the following month. It was not an easy one either, built as it was on 2 years of silence that would take longer than a single storm to fully unwind, on a mother-in-law's diminished but not entirely erased presence at the edges of their lives, on a husband still learning, by inches, how to say plainly the things his rank had trained him to withhold. But it was shared, freely, by 2 people who had each, in their own fashion, finally stopped waiting to be given what they could build themselves. And that, Iris thought, watching the last of the storm's gray clouds finally break apart over the square outside to let a clean, ordinary, entirely undramatic sun through, that was more than enough. The rain had stopped some time before dawn the night the storm broke over Larkspur Row, though neither of them had noticed the precise moment it happened. Too occupied with a hand neither had been willing to release, and when the light finally came, pale and clean and utterly indifferent to the wreckage or the wonder it illuminated in equal measure, it had found them still there, still joined, her thimble-worn fingers laced through his, the whole quiet house around them, holding nothing back any longer. And somewhere beyond the window a single bird had begun, without ceremony, without audience, to sing the ordinary morning into being, as if nothing extraordinary had happened at all, and as if everything had.